Hi, hello. This is what I look like, in case some of you didn't know. You might be surprised because you probably didn't imagine that I would have a beard. Anyways, what I wanted to talk about in this video and sort of do it in a different format was to discuss how the two hemispheres of the brain and their asymmetry and their compartmentalization um, gives rise to the phenomenon that we call the ego. And it's something about the division between these two hemispheres, their incompatibility, the fact that they're kind of wrestling with each other, as well as the times when they need to be unified, when there needs to be sort of a coherence between what they want, that gives rise to the ego. It's that fighting and that cohesion which characterizes the ego, because the ego is not just one thing. It's a process. It's something that continuously transforms, but also resists being transformed because naturally the ego just wants to be stable. It doesn't want to have to break down and reassemble itself all the time. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that when we get in more into the psychology of the ego. For now, I want to talk about why it is that the hemispheres give rise to the ego. So, in case you didn't know, the brain is divided between two hemispheres, the left and the right. And for reasons which aren't entirely clear, vertebrates have this feature where the left side of the body is controlled by the right brain, and the left side of the body is controlled, and the right side of the body, sorry, is controlled by the left brain. So this is my right hand. This is being controlled by the left hemisphere of my brain, or the corresponding part of that hemisphere. And normally you would think that the two hemispheres are pretty much just copies of each other. That's what you would just assume, that they're kind of there for redundancy. One side for one half of the body, the other side for the other half. But what we actually find is that there is a significant level of asymmetry, which means that they aren't exactly the same. They differ in fundamental ways, in both structure and function, and startlingly and surprisingly in personality. In fact, you can think of the two hemispheres of the brain as being distinct people, distinct personalities. In a sense, it's not even as though you have two sides to your personality. It's as though there are two distinct, incompatible personalities that see the world in fundamentally different ways, and they both exist inside one head. And this incompatibility gives rise to something new. It's not as if there are just two different personalities in two different directions. It's that the fact that these two different things are inside one head, which gives rise to a completely new thing. A few new things, actually. The ego just being the one that we're focusing on right now. And another important thing to establish regarding this connection between the two hemispheres is the connection, which is the corpus callosum, which is a band of nerve fibers which connects the two hemispheres. But it doesn't just connect them. It also has the function of inhibiting the other hemisphere. Most of the neurons in the corpus callosum actually inhibit the other hemisphere rather than just sending information. The rest, of course, are to send information between the two hemispheres, but the vast majority of neurons actually inhibit the other hemisphere. So there's always a part of yourself, and you've probably noticed this, there's always a part of yourself which is actively trying to stop another part of yourself. Like when you try to stop yourself from procrastinating or, doing something, following a bad habit or something. The importance of this division and compartmentalization is best understood when you understand the two differing and incompatible attitudes of the left hemisphere compared to the right hemisphere. And if you're left-handed, this switches, but fundamentally it's the same thing. So, like I said, there's a few ways in which the hemispheres are asymmetrical to each other. I suppose the first and most obvious one is handedness. We preferentially use one of our hands, whether that's the right hand, which is common in most people, or the left hand, which is less common but still pretty common. And then you have ambidextrous people, which are relatively rare. But essentially, using one hand preferentially causes there to be changes in our brain, where the area that controls our hand in the left hemisphere, if you're right-handed, is significantly larger and significantly more developed and interconnected than the corresponding area on the opposite side. And that's one difference. And in fact, that difference actually is very important, but it's kind of hard to explain right now. But The other difference, which is, I guess, more significant for our discussion, is the fact that language is preferential to the left hemisphere. So both hemispheres absorb language and understand language. And in fact, you need both hemispheres to properly understand language. Language becomes very difficult to understand, which is one hemisphere, whether that's the right or the left. Um, Especially the nuances of language and and context and things like that. But the left hemisphere is significantly more verbal. And when you talk and when you hear your inner monologue, that's your left hemisphere. So the word sort of like word units of language are largely dealt with in the left hemisphere. And now, as I mentioned before, the two hemispheres have two incompatible views of the world. And this is shown through a number of things. So the right hemisphere can be thought of as the hemisphere we use whenever we approach something new and unfamiliar. Whenever something's unfamiliar, it's the right hemisphere which is more activated than the left hemisphere. But when we deal with something which is familiar, which we have experience of and have experienced before, it's the left hemisphere that takes over and approaches that object. Another significant difference has to do with attention, the types of attention that the hemispheres bring about. The right hemisphere has broad general attention. It takes sort of account of the general situation that's going on around you and constructs it into an overall big picture, we could say. But the left hemisphere kind of does the opposite. What it does is it looks into the world and is very focused and sort of tries to remove things from their context. Like it's like sort of the thing that pieces the elements of a situation together. Like it'll look at, for example, in front of me is my phone, my pen, this light. And so it's the left hemisphere that sort of takes note of those very individual aspects, and it's the right hemisphere which reconstructs them into a bigger picture. And so you could say that when you're conscious of something, it's your left hemisphere which is doing that. But the thing about the left hemisphere is that because it doesn't have open attention, it has sort of very narrow attention. Its attention isn't necessarily to things as they are, but rather it's always trying to impose something which it already has experienced onto that situation. And this has to do with the fact that we can't understand anything unless we compare it to something else that we've experienced before. It's a very useful thing to understand. It's very useful to understand something, or it's very easy to understand something, but you can contrast it with something else. That's what I was trying to say. So contrast is what creates sort of understanding of new things. And the left hemisphere is always trying to contrast what it already knows. Whereas the right hemisphere is open to more of the idea that this might be something a completely new experience that can't be compared to something previously. And so these two different ways of perceiving the world, which are very significant, you can almost think of one hemisphere as trying to separate everything in its environment, trying to take things and sort of grasp them to be held by your mind. Whereas the other hemisphere is trying to build everything and put everything together. So one kind of divides and one puts things together. You could argue that that's the difference between order and chaos. And in fact, maybe archetypally is why we see order and chaos as a major theme in a lot of areas, in a lot of philosophies and symbols. As I was saying before, these two differences are what cause there to be an ego in the first place. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, but the fact that you have an inner monologue, that you have an ego, is really interesting because what it implies is something that most people don't think, is that whenever you speak with the assumption that somebody is listening, right? So if you hear this internal monologue all the time and it's speaking, there's somebody listening, and that somebody, you can argue, is the other hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is the one that's jabbering all the time, and it's the right hemisphere that's listening to this jabbering. And one distinction that might be useful to sort of understand this is the distinction between I and me. Me as the subject, and me as the object. One is kind of active, the other is passive. One is an acting agent, the other is a passive receiver of information. And so that generally characterizes the ego. But what I wanted to talk about now is how, having set up the sort of differences between the two hemispheres and how they communicate, how that actually contributes to there being consciousness. I guess I'll just start with consciousness, since ego is like a natural extension of consciousness. So how are you conscious of anything? This is a very big problem. Human understanding is a massive paradox. How is it possible that our brains, which are constituted of physical matter. How is it possible that physical matter can understand things and understand the universe? Well, the short answer is metaphor. And metaphor is something which is primarily dealt with by the right hemisphere of the brain. The right hemisphere is what creates metaphor. And by metaphor, I mean something very specific. Two specific things, to be clear. The first thing is the fact that when we try to understand something, we have to refer back to something we previously understood. And new concepts are built sort of through this chain of metaphors. For example, here's one example. The hands of a clock. So when we want to talk about the hands of a clock, we're using the metaphor of hands, our hands, something that we're familiar with, something that we're intimately familiar with since they're a part of our body, and imposing that onto clocks to sort of better understand the clock and sort of, I like the word consciousize, but sort of to consciousize the clock. And what by consciousize, I mean to make conscious, to make that into an object of consciousness. And so we're always imposing, again, that's the left hemisphere which does that, but it's sort of the right hemisphere which provides these categories of comparison which the left hemisphere uses when it tries to understand the world. The other aspect of metaphor is the fact that any word or any concept has, Julian Jaynes calls them paraphiers, but essentially these are just things which are associated with any idea that sort of connect back to other ideas. There's a lot of examples of this, but like when you think of something, when you think of a computer, the idea of a computer, multiple things come to mind, usually shaped on your past experience of what a computer is and what you would consider to be, what to constitute a computer. Somebody who's super familiar with computers might imagine things differently compared to someone who just uses computers casually and doesn't really understand what's going on. And these two different people have different conceptions when they think of the word computer. But when we think about a broad sort of object like computer, it invokes a lot of ideas. And the thing is, those ideas don't necessarily come into consciousness. They're just kind of in the back of our mind. Like when you think about that idea, I'll try to use a different example. The one I used in a previous video was the idea of love being like a rose. I'm wearing red right now, and for some reason there's a connection between the concept of love and the color red. Like when you think of love, you might think of red, but of course there's love has nothing to do with red inherently. It's just that through culture that sort of just becomes the association, or that like boys like blue and girls like pink. That's just through association. There's nothing inherent there that causes that to happen. It's just that when we think of, we sort of mentally connect these things automatically. Based on culture, but also based on other reasons, maybe even logical reasons. So regarding the idea of consciousness, it makes sense to a certain extent that consciousness is in the left hemisphere. As in, when I'm conscious of something and when I'm paying attention to it, and when I'm imposing something I already know onto that thing in an attempt to understand it, that's the left hemisphere. But during this sort of process of being conscious of individual things, there's something else happening in the right hemisphere. What's happening in the right hemisphere is, again, it relates to the open attention of the right hemisphere, is that everything that you're being conscious of is being constructed into a narrative which builds a bigger picture. So you're conscious of individual things at any given time, but at the same time, the other half of your brain is sort of taking all these elements and building them into a general picture. And you don't have access to the picture through your consciousness unless you refocus on individual parts, but it feels like you're understanding. A good example of this is the fact that you're understanding these sentences, because I'm not just saying individual words. If I just said one word at a time, like if I do right now, the two hemispheres, you're paying attention to each individual word. But if I say an entire sentence, you have to construct that sentence and build a relationship between those elements of the sentence, the individual words, and that's happening in your right hemisphere. So your right hemisphere does understand language; it just understands the bigger picture of language, while the left hemisphere understands the individual words and pieces them together into a narrative. And so that's the basic way. That's the basic way consciousness functions. And there's a lot to this, and there's a lot to the idea of metaphors being what constructs consciousness. And remember something I mentioned before, the fact that the left hemisphere, which again is the language hemisphere, which again is the conscious hemisphere, we could say, is closely associated with the right hand. And because language kind of functions like the right hand. Language grasps hold of things and grasps hold of concepts. When we have words for things, we kind of make that concept available for us to use and for our minds to use. Um, what I like to bring up when I talk about this is the fact that or abstract concepts ultimately have their origins in very concrete things. For example, um, when we say that I've grasped it, I've comprehended something. The word comprehend means to just to I think it means to touch in Latin originally, whatever, something to do with touch, something to do with grabbing. But that metaphor became a metaphor for understanding, for comprehending something. Understanding. What does the word understand mean? Well, when you stand under something, apparently that's a metaphor for being able to sort of, comprehend it. It's even hard to talk about what we're talking about without using metaphorical notions. And it's those metaphors of other things which are similar to more abstract concepts, which builds our vocabulary and it builds our understanding of the world and of ideas. And so we need metaphor to be able to understand anything. But it's the right hemisphere which sort of provides these metaphorical notions which the left compares them to. And so the phenomenon of the ego has, again, these two components, the right hemisphere and its sort of big picture view of the world, and the left hemisphere and its more narrow view of the world. We can think of that narrow view of the world as the I, and that broader picture as the me. So the ego, again, is your concept of yourself. I'd say the ego has two dimensions to it. It's the fact that whenever you do anything, it feels like there's an acting, willing subject inside your brain, which is the commander, which is the guy who tells your body what to do in a sense. And so it feels like kind of like that feels like you. Like if you were to define yourself or to think about what yourself is, it's just kind of like a metaphorical idea of myself inside my head, and that I'm the one who makes decisions and I'm the one who talks and commands, the rest of me to do something specific, which is very necessary for human society because we can't just rely on our instincts as we once did. Culture is very sophisticated, and our instincts and our genetic heritage isn't equipped to just deal with culture. We have to adapt to culture, and we do that largely through language. There's the dimension of your self-identity, that concept of who you are, who you think you are, like what do you imagine when you imagine yourself, like how you would describe your personality to somebody if somebody asks you. That's that dimension to the ego. And there's another dimension, which is more of the left hemisphere, which is sort of the acting agent in the world, the kind of commander which tells you what to do and sort of guides you. And that reflects back on your self-concept because you immediately assume that it's yourself telling yourself what to do, right? And so what is this self? Well, the idea of yourself is primarily in the right hemisphere, because it's a very general concept of yourself. Yourself, the idea of yourself isn't a simple thing. It's a lot of different ideas packaged together. It could be your past memories, your attitudes, your feelings, your opinions towards the world. All of that constitutes your self idea. But the left hemisphere is just sort of the thing that acts on that general concept's behalf. So when you direct your behavior, when you're conscious and you're using your conscious will and effort, you're using your left hemisphere to sort of direct the other hemisphere, which contains that self concept, and order it around and do specific things. And again, if you really think about it, it isn't one hemisphere is the ego and the other isn't. It's kind of that both hemispheres having this kind of antagonistic relationship with each other, which creates the ego. So the left hemisphere is preferential regarding things that it already knows, that are already established. So things like rules and societal norms and social expectations, it's the left hemisphere which sort of is the one that sort of accepts those, because those are considered normal. Those are conditioned to in a person's social environment, and they become familiarized, and that's sort of how the left hemisphere goes about its business. The right hemisphere, since it's more open, and it's technically, in a lot of ways, more open-minded than the left hemisphere, which is more rigid and less open-minded, and it doesn't like to accept the possibility of new information or new things. It likes to just kind of stay as it is and assume that the way it understands the world is adequate, which can get people in a lot of problems if they're really stubborn and refuse to change their opinion, for example. which I am guilty of if I have to be honest. But it is also a good thing to have crystallized beliefs, because otherwise you're just kind of in an existential dread, and then you're moving on from one thing to the other without ever really having any stability. So again, the thing I emphasize is balance between these two aspects, not preferential to one or not preferential to other, but balance. If you're overly using your left hemisphere in your world, which according to Ian McGilchrist in the book that he wrote, which I'm basing a lot of this off of, is a big problem in the modern world. Us using preferentially our left hemispheres, which are the more rigid and don't want to change and are kind of narrow-minded, versus the right hemisphere, which is much more open-minded, much more artistic even, one could say. So since the left hemisphere is always reimposing ideas that it's already experienced, it has difficulty with new ideas and new information, and sort of changing its worldview and changing its standpoint and adapting its way of understanding to new ideas. It's always trying to impose things it's already learned. So how is it possible to learn new things? Well, what happens is this. The right hemisphere approaches a new object, and the left hemisphere tries to sort of impose something onto that object, some idea that it already knows. And sort of the discrepancies between that concept and that object are sort of caught by the right hemisphere, which sort of builds a bigger picture of what that object actually is. And so the pattern we have is that the right hemisphere approaches a new object, the left hemisphere attempts to impose something it already knows, and then the right hemisphere reintegrates the new information which came about through that contrast. That's why contrast is needed to understand new things. And it poses a huge number of questions about human understanding. Are we really understanding things, or are we just kind of creating this hallucinatory realm in our own minds and hoping that there's a correspondence between our imaginations, which are technically just imaginations, and the real world? I'd say in a lot of ways, we've done really well for ourselves in terms of expanding our consciousness. We have grasped the nature of a lot of things, especially in mathematics and physics, where our metaphorical concepts do correspond to reality. But, oftentimes they don't. And for the average person, they might imagine and believe a million things which aren't true, but since they've been experienced by the left hemisphere, the brain just kind of takes it as true. But the truth is, there's a lot of ambiguity in existence and in reality, and it's the right hemisphere which can process that ambiguity. It's okay with ambiguity. It's okay with the fact that things aren't clear cut, that it's not easy to sort of divide things into two poles and then put them as opposites, that there's contrast in between. The right hemisphere is good at that. The right hemisphere is also significantly more empathetic, and it's also the one we use in social settings, when we empathize with other people. Now, this is a very bizarre phenomenon, because what is it when you have a conversation with someone? What is it really? What are you doing? What is it from your perspective? Because you're talking with someone, but in a way you kind of project your idea of that person onto them and then talk to that. If this sounds weird to you, it's because it is, but if you really think about it, it's true. I think Nietzsche has a quote in Beyond Good and Evil that's something like, I had it here to pull it up, but something like, we act as we do in a dream. We fabricate the person with whom we associate, and then we forget the fact. And what he's trying to say here is that when you're in a dream, you're always encountering people who talk to you, but it's just your own mind creating people. Well, Nietzsche's saying when you do something in real life, when you talk to somebody in real life and have a conversation with them, you do the exact same thing. Excuse me. Where essentially you create a concept of that person in your mind, project it onto them, and then kind of just have a conversation with yourself and interpret their words according to your schema. Which is why really, anytime you have a conversation with someone, you can't actually know what they mean when they speak. Kind of a devastating truth about social interactions is that no form of communication is seamless and completely clear. There's always misunderstandings, and it's always because you're empathizing with a person, creating a concept of them in your head, and then listening to that concept speak back to you through their words. If that makes sense. I feel like I didn't do a great job of explaining that, but but hopefully that's clear enough. Anyways, the point I want to make here is that it's the right hemisphere that's doing that sort of engaging with another being, with another living being. This is another difference between the two hemispheres. The right hemisphere is more attuned to living beings. It's sort of like the category of living and inanimate, or just an object, or just a plain object, is already ingrained in our minds. Where the right hemisphere deals with living things, and is more empathetic to living things and understands their situation and understands them as other beings, whereas the left hemisphere just kind of sees the world as objects, as inanimate objects, disimbued with not imbued with life. You could say disimbued. I don't know what I'm trying to say there. So the phenomenon of the ego is those two components: the directing self, the left hemisphere, which is directing yourself, and the right hemisphere, which contains that self concept. And the ego initially forms when there starts to become a conflict between these two incompatible ways of seeing the world. And I've argued, and you could argue, that the reason the ego forms has to do with the fact that you have a natural self, a natural instinctual genetic self, which does what it's genetically programmed to do. But then you also have a socially constructed self, which is based on culture and cultural beliefs and whatnot. And the conflict between the hemispheres, which sort of gives birth to the ego, which sort of causes a person to realize that they're divided and that there's a part of themselves which needs to stop the other part of themselves, is when rules and regulations and things like that get in the way of instinct, where you want to do something based on instinct, but you have this voice in your head telling you, which have probably been given to you by parental figures or authoritative figures, telling you not to do those things, not to just merely behave instinctually, but to do this, to wake up at this time, to make your bed. You know, people don't naturally do that. You have to be told to do it, and then eventually, by habit, you'll just start doing it. But that's sort of where the conflict is. And it's this conflict between the two selves that causes there to be a voice which has to sort of negotiate between them. So this is why, in many ways, the phenomenon of consciousness arises from a polarity between the two hemispheres. It's because they're looking at things in different ways that they're first of all, that consciousness exists, because consciousness, again, isn't just one thing. It isn't a specific function in your brain. It's a relationship between the two hemispheres, passing information, one, piecing the elements of a situation into a story, the other hemisphere containing that story and understanding the whole picture of that story, the same way you understand this whole video. If you watch the video up till now, you've so far understood everything that I've said. Well, but the thing is, you can't just access that information. You know what I mean? You can't just access those individual bits that I told you. It's sort of all constructed into a big picture by your right hemisphere. And each of these individual words that I speak, that's what your left hemisphere is processing. It's like understanding those words. It's like, okay, understood, attached to the general picture. Understood, attached to the general picture. I think I'm doing the wrong hemisphere. I think it's this hemisphere to this hemisphere. But either way, you get the idea. It's one hemisphere sort of understands the units, the other understands the whole picture. So like any idea, the idea of the self is metaphorical. You can imagine in some point in the past, there was no ego. It didn't feel like there was an idea of the self. It's really hard to imagine what that's like to not have an ego, to not have a concept of yourself. But you could argue that before there were names, because again, names had to be invented at some point in history. Before there were names, there was no ego. You didn't feel like an individual self. You just felt like you were kind of a member of your social group, of your tribe or your community, whatever it is, of your village or even. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is how people saw the world. They didn't see themselves as like an individual apart from the world. They saw themselves as one unit amidst a group. That's how they perceived themselves. But this sort of individualization, that's how I've described the process of the ego formation in the first place, as a process of becoming a separate individual from everybody else. This has to do with the left hemisphere and the way the left hemisphere tries to wrestle things out of a context. The left hemisphere also wrestles yourself out of the context of other people and tries to distinguish yourself and sort of draw the boundaries between self and non-self of either other people or other objects. The growth of the ego and the evolution of the ego and the way the ego changes, the way I've described it as dying and being reborn, or decrystallizing and crystallizing, that process again has to do with sort of an asymmetry between the two hemispheres. So when your ego is stable and when you have a stable self-concept, it's you primarily exist with your left hemisphere. You approach the world with your left hemisphere, as in through language. that's how you know what to do. It is through language. But the left hemisphere again is very rigid and always tries to refer back to things it already knows. It's very reluctant to take in new information and integrate them into your understanding of the world. But of course, that has to happen because eventually, given enough time, you'll encounter a situation where your preformed schematics, the preformed sort of ideas of the world that you've built in your mind, will no longer be compatible with reality. And that's what we can call ego death. And what happens during ego death? There's a lot of things to say, but essentially, that transfer of information from left to right as the ego commanding the right hemisphere, you could say it flips, where now it's the right hemisphere sending information backwards. And this happens all the time. Your hemispheres are communicating all the time, but the modes of communication are different. You could say the language of the hemispheres are different from one another. One could argue that the left hemisphere speaks through language. The right hemisphere speaks through a different language, through images, through symbols, through just very broad ideas which contain a huge amount of meaning as compared to the left hemisphere's very individualized units of meaning. And this is sort of what happens when you dream. It's the right hemisphere which is sort of creating the imagistic quality of the dream. And that, of course, is, one could argue, is the right hemisphere trying to communicate with the left hemisphere. And why does it do this? Well, it does this when there is a need for there to be new information integrated into one's ego concept or a concept of the world. The right hemisphere, is much more open than the left, meaning it's willing to see the ambiguities between things, and it integrates that ambiguity into the left hemisphere's view of the world. And so the left hemisphere evolves. It doesn't just, continue to accept the world as it previously understood it. It now accepts a new understanding of the world thanks to the right hemisphere, which is much more empathetic, which much more open-minded and willing to sort of accept new information and new ideas and things which are unfamiliar. It's the bridge to the unfamiliar, one could say, and the method of accepting it. And so this causes a transformation into the left side of the hemisphere, where the left hemisphere has to imagine the concepts that it already had. And again, it does through metaphor by comparing things it already knew and sort of building new information from that. And now a person understands something more deeply. And then again, the ego crystallizes. And now this becomes your understanding of the world. See, it's a continual process. The ego breaks down and then it recrystallizes, and then it breaks down and then it recrystallizes. And this is continuously happening throughout people's lives. In some people, it happens much more often than others. In some people, it barely happens, but it's still expected to happen. And you've probably know an experience that caused this to happen, where you had to just sort of reevaluate what the world was. And it was your right hemisphere which did that reevaluation and then integrated it to your experiences of the left. And then in a sense, you've become a new person. You've become a new ego. And people don't realize that they become a new ego. It just kind of happens automatically. But it's ego transformation is super interesting, because have you ever thought about what you were like in the past? Like the kind of person you used to be? People don't realize how different they were maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, unless you have footage of yourself and you can see what you used to be like. You would be kind of shocked. You're like, I was kind of like a different person. I had a lot of the same qualities. Here's another way you could see. I've been looking at old text messages that I sent 10 years ago, and I'm like, why would I ever write this? This doesn't sound like me, but it was me in the past. It was a different ego, which then broke down and recrystallized into something else. And so, again, the ego needs to be stable. I don't want to make it sound like breaking down the ego is you need to do that. To an extent, I think, if I'm being honest, my honest opinion is that most people should experience more ego death. By which means they need to be more open-minded and more open to the possibility that their preformed conceptions are inadequate to handle what the world really is. The world is a very complicated place. And things are complicated. It's not easy to accept complicated things. We prefer things to be simple. We prefer very simple pictures to understand the world. But the world isn't that simple. In any domain, it's not that simple. Human psychology is super complicated. All these things which we tend to simplify to a great degree end up being so much more complicated. And we have to be able to accept that that complexity, but also know how to approach complexity. It's the right hemisphere which is good for dealing with the complexities of things. But most people think with their left hemispheres, and so it's a big problem with learning because a lot of people are just trying to impose things that they already knew onto new information rather than having the open mind necessary to learn new things. And of course, that's just how the brain is. The brain doesn't want to accept new information. At a point, it just kind of wants to accept, okay, I've learned everything I need to know. Let's just move on with life and live in this way. And ideally, that would be great. That our egos could just crystallize around a few ideas, and then we live with these ideas for the rest of our lives, and things are great. But unfortunately, human society changes really quickly. It's changing rapidly. And so whatever conceptions you had will inevitably be inadequate in the future. Which is why this process of ego death and transformation and recrystallization is so vital for living in the modern world. So hopefully that gives a general picture of why the two hemispheres and sort of their tangential experiences of existence and their tangential and incompatible ways of viewing the world, and the sort of tension between them, but also the necessity of reunifying them, gives birth to the ego. The ego feels like one thing. It feels like I'm just one person. But of course, it's not just one thing. It's a process. It's a continuous process of crystallizing and decrystallizing and breaking down. So yeah, hopefully that gives you a general picture of what I wanted to discuss. I haven't touched on everything that I wanted to get through. But if there's a lot to discuss regarding this model and a huge amount of information and a lot of more supporting points. What I discussed in this video is a very general picture of what's going on between the two hemispheres and how it gives birth to the ego. But there's a lot more going on, especially with respect to metaphor. I want to make an entire video just about metaphors and how that builds our understanding of the world, and how metaphors are super important for the concept of the ego, because the ego is a metaphor. The ego is the idea of yourself. It's a metaphorical concept. But of course, this metaphorical concept has important ramifications in the real world. We could say that the ego isn't real, but it has real ramifications. And that's sort of that's another topic for another time. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully you enjoyed me speaking like this through my presentation. I wanted to change things up a little bit because I was kind of getting sick of my old format. I'm still going to continue that format because I find it very useful for conveying my thoughts. But I also want to do more of this stuff where I just talk to the camera and just give a general overview of a big topic. And I definitely want to discuss this a lot more, and I want to discuss a lot more topics in this way. So yeah, if you've listened up to now, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.